Hello guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another Dragonflight tier list. Today we have melee specifically for Mythic Plus. I have made this exact tier list before, but that was pre-tuning and it was an attempt to try and predict the tier list before we saw any tuning and any passes to bring specs in line. So it was really looking at utility, it was looking at tankiness, and it was trying to see if the changes were generally good for AoE and generally good for Cleave and Mythic Plus, right? Or whether they were more single target focused or anything like that, right? This is completely different. We've been through most of the tuning because we're only really 3 weeks away from Dragonflight, right? I imagine there's only going to be 1 or 2 tuning passes left, and they're going to be pretty light touch. The current version of the beta is actually on the PTR as a release candidate. So that to me is screaming that there's not that much change to come. So now feels like the perfect time to try and come up with these tier lists. I will be recreating these just before Dragonflight, and I'm also going to be doing some tier lists based on simming numbers, right? So I'm going to be simming all of these specs in many different scenarios to try and work out what's actually doing the best on paper. That doesn't mean that it will do the best in reality, but that will give you more information to try and understand what's going to be performing well, right? If you're interested in either of those things, so my final tier lists, or you're interested in simming numbers, feel free to drop me a subscribe and then it'll come through your inbox and you should be able to see it. But without further ado then, let's immediately get started, right? The first spec that I've got right at the top is Outlaw Rogue. So Outlaw I had at the top previously, and then literally 2 hours after I released my previous tier list, Outlaw got nerfed, and everyone was like, oh, it's just been nerfed in the ground, it's going to be useless. But it turns out that wasn't the case. It was already just doing insane numbers. Now it's just doing great numbers. It's not like the best AoE. It's not the best single target, but it's right up there in both. It's still probably one of the tankier specs in the game and brings incredible utility. So I think it really deserves its spot in S tier here. I don't know if it will be an absolute must-have, right? Like the current, say, Season 3, Season 4 of Dragonflight, where it was still A+ tier, but I really think it's one of the best specs and it's in one of the best positions going into Dragonflight for sure. It's not doing like insane numbers in AoE. There are definitely specs that are doing more damage in AoE, but it's incredibly consistent, and specifically single target, I really think it's right up there, which is very, very valuable with the dungeon pool that we have. Next, Unholy DK. Okay, so I actually had Unholy DK at the top of A previously. It has seen some slight tweaks in between the tier list and now, but not too much has changed, to be honest. The only reason why I brought it up is because now that we've been able to test everything with others in the dungeons and actually do Mythic Plus testing, right, I've come to realize that Unholy is actually shining. It is doing a lot of damage, right? It really is doing a lot of damage, and the only reason why I had it at top of A before and not in S is because I didn't have the guts to put it in S when it had been essentially D tier for all of Shadowlands, right? Now that I've tested it, I'm pretty certain that this is going to be one of the best specs in the game. It does insane damage. It really does insane damage. It's not doing the best single target, but honestly, it's AoE. It's just, there's no one that can challenge it. Like uncapped AoE, where ads are lasting like 20 seconds, is just perfect for Unholy, and it's destroying the damage meters. It's also just getting insane tankiness, right? Will of Necropolis is just ridiculously good for Mythic Plus. It's also got incredible utility now with the number of grips that it's getting. Slappy Hands is coming forwards, right? Abomination Limb. So there's a lot of utility that it's getting. It's getting Blinding Sleet, and it's tanky, and its damage is really good. It belongs in S tier for me. Next, we have Windwalker. So Windwalker has just seen some huge nerfs, probably somewhere between like 10 and 15% in terms of overall damage in Mythic Plus, something like that, right? That's just off the top of my head. Those numbers have not been calculated, but I guess it's something like that, yeah? Before, it was just like super S tier. Like I would have just had it here. I do think it could still be there, but because of the nerfs, it definitely dropped its damage, right? So its damage isn't quite as good, and I just don't think it's quite as tanky as these two specs. It's still very tanky, right? Don't get me wrong. It's just not quite as tanky as DK or Rogue. And in terms of utility, it still brings great utility. Ring of Peace is just an incredible ability. It has leg sweep, it has paralysis, right? It has decent utility, but it doesn't have insane utility like Rogue. Like Rogue just to me has standout utility, whereas Windwalker's not quite there. So I think it Definitely deserves its spot on S still. Like, it's doing insane damage still. Even after the nerfs, it's still one of the best damage and specs in the game. But it's not doing quite as much as it was before. And it also isn't quite as tanky or bringing as much utility as the other two. But I still think it's going to be insanely good. Like, it has to belong in S tier for me. Next we have Feral. This position hasn't really changed. It was in like top of A before, I think, just behind Unholy. It's exactly the same still. The changes that it's got are very, very good for Mythic Plus, and it stays exactly the same. It's still ringing true. It does a lot of AoE damage, like it's similar to Unholy, where it's just, if it has like targets lasting for 20 seconds and there's 20 targets, it's going to be one of the best there for AoE. It really is doing a lot of damage. Its single target is similar. It's not quite as good as, say, like Outlaw, but it's still doing excellent single target as well. It's tanky. It brings utility, right? It doesn't bring quite as much utility as Balance. So Balance has Solar Beam and Force of Nature over it, but otherwise everything else, Mark, right? 1 minute Raw, 30-second Interrupting Raw. It still has Typhoon, it has Air Souls, it has Off Healing, right? But all of this stuff, so it's still got a bunch of utility. It's still tanky, and it's getting all this damage, so I think it rightfully deserves its place in A now. I really, really do think it's going to be a good spec. Havoc. So Havoc. This before was up in S tier with Rogue, and it was my two S tier specs were Outlaw Rogue, and then they were Havoc. Havoc has slowly just had a lot of its AoE damage completely removed. When I say completely removed, that's not necessarily true, but it's just slowly had a lot of its damage removed, where I don't think it's doing quite as much AoE as it needed to. It still has incredible tankiness. It still has great utility, right? It's one of the pillars of Mythic Plus in terms of always consistently being like middle of the pack or above because of this, and is getting good AoE, so I think it's actually going to shift up into A tier now. But I just don't think it quite gets up to the level of like Unholy or the level of Windwalker, right? Like those two specs just feel like they're doing more damage to me, so it needs to be a tier underneath. So it's in A, but it still is very, very strong. Enhancement, right? Enhance had some of the wildest nerfs I've ever seen. So it has got a flat 25% damage reduction across the board. That, if it was going to get back to the position that it was in, right, that would mean it needs a 33% damage increase across the board, right? And the most that you ever really see specs getting is something like 10%. That means it's going to need about three of those buffs to get back to where it was. That's insane how big those nerfs were. They were something like twice as bad as the nerfs that hit Windwalker, so they were really, really bad. Now, it was already doing the most damage in the game, right? Or at least up there in the conversation for it with Windwalker. Now it's been dropped down a peg. I think it's still doing very good damage. It's not doing insane damage, but it's doing decent, right? It's doing pretty good. But its tankiness isn't quite there. It's nowhere near as tanky as like Rogue, DK, right? So it's definitely not there. Its utility is decent. Like the Shaman tree is crazy good. 25-second AoE stop now. You've still got Sundering. You have Cap Totem, so you've got like 3 AoE stops, yeah. You have like Poison Cleansing Totem now. You have Off Healing. There's a bunch of utility that you bring, but I just don't think that it's quite enough to push it any higher than like the bottom of A tier. It's really good. I'm just not too sure if its damage is going to be able to carry it, basically. It's just not bringing as much tankiness and utility as some of these other specs. So I think it's in a pretty good spot there. Fury. So Fury Warrior, I have left at the same tier as Arms, but what I am going to say is I'm going to do both of these at the same time. One of these specs is going to go up and another one's going to go down. Like that is essentially what will end up happening in my mind. Similar, so you can see here, Unholy DK is up here, Frost is down here. Frost isn't a bad spec, it's still tanky, right? It still has utility. It does decent damage, but because Unholy just does more and is seemingly better than Frost is going to be all the way down here. That's what I imagine is going to happen with the warrior specs. I've just not played with enough warriors to really tell you yet. So this is just me openly and honestly telling you I actually don't know which one of these is going to go up and which one's going to go down. I imagine Arms is coming down and Fury's going up, and it'll look something like this. Maybe even like this, right? Where Fury's actually better than Enhance. But at the moment, I'm not sure, so I'm just going to leave them both in the middle, so between where they'll end up. And I'll try, and after Sims and I've done some more testing, right, I'll try and really pin that down. But for now, I'm going to leave Fury top of B and Arms just underneath it. Fury has been doing good damage. I've played like 1 key with the Fury Warrior and it was doing great damage, but it just felt like it was inflated because it has so many good cooldowns that if you just pull a pack and then it just drops all of its cooldowns and it does massive burst. And to be honest with you, Arms still gets the same cooldowns, right? I've never even played with an Arms Warrior in Mythic Plus, unfortunately. There's just not many going around to try and play with. From my testing, they're both doing pretty good like burst AoE damage, so I'm leaving them the same. We'll just have to see where they actually end up. Ret's actually doing okay damage. It's doing decent damage. It's just had its tankiness removed, right? Like, why can't... I don't understand why it can't just have a 1 minute Divine Protection. If it had a 1 minute 20% DR, I'd be more than happy with, like, bumping this up maybe if it got really good damage. I actually don't think it has insane damage. It's probably similar to, like, Havoc levels of damage maybe. Something along those lines, right? But it just doesn't bring as much utility. It's not as tanky as Havoc, so it has to be beneath it. Like, it has to be down here. It's okay. I really wish it was better, but it's not, unfortunately. I love the spec. It feels great that you can use things like Lay on Hands, Bop, Blessing of Sacrifice, right, to try and help your group. It's just the fact that you, as a class, aren't tanky enough, and you're not doing like insane damage numbers. If you're doing insane damage numbers, then maybe there'd be space for you in the meta, but I don't see that happening. I just don't see it. Next, we have Sub-Rogue. Sub-Rogue actually looks really good. It could easily be up here and like perform at this level, but because of what I just discussed between Unholy and Frost, I think it'll just be down here because most rogues, I think, will be playing Outlaw for the majority of the time. Sub-Rogue definitely overtakes Outlaw, right? When there's lots and lots of targets, like it just does way more damage in uncapped scenarios. But from what I've tested on like these 5 target packs and specifically on bosses, Outlaw can just be doing its single target rotation, right, and take single target talents, so it's doing way, way better in those scenarios. And because of that, and because I think the representation for Rogue is going to be with Outlaw, I've just bumped Subtlety down. It's still good, it still brings insane utility, it's very tanky, right? I just think because Outlaw is going to be the main Rogue spec, that knocks Subtlety down. Same goes for Assassination. I think Assassination will do decently, but it doesn't have enough AoE damage versus Sub-Rogue. The damage that it does bring is okay, but it would need a lot more Garrote damage in my mind to really get pushed up any higher. And I don't think that Blizzard are willing to unleash Garrote. From what I've tested, it's doing decently, right? It is actually doing okay. And to be honest with you, if it was doing enough damage, it would actually take over from Outlaw because it has Garrote, which is a silence, which is additional to Outlaw, right? And it's also bringing Iron Wire, so that's a reduced damage. So it has like more utility than the other Rogue specs. But to be honest with you, I just don't think it will ever get the damage that we needed to do that. So Outlaw is just going to be sitting at the top here. Next, Frost DK. I've already really discussed it. It's actually okay. Like, it does good damage, especially inside CDs, like Inside Breath is doing decent damage. It's just not doing as much damage as Unholy, right? And because it's not doing as much, its representation is going to be much lower, so I think it'll drop all the way down here, and it'll be one of the worst specs in the game just because not many people are going to be playing it, because Unholy is just going to be better. So like most DKs will be playing this unless they're a die-hard Frost fan. Last and absolutely least again, I'm putting Survival Hunter right down at the bottom. I've not really been able to play with it with anyone else like testing it because everyone's just playing BM Hunter. Because everyone's going to be playing BM, then it means Survival's going to be much lower down. It's also just not tanky. You don't have that much utility to bring to the group. The changes have just gutted its AoE damage. It's staying right down on the bottom still. For me, it's a spec that could have had its 4-set brought forwards, but just in a nerfed version. I didn't mind the Kill Command and Bomb reset playstyle, but clearly Blizzard didn't like it, and a lot of others didn't like it, so they've moved away from that. But the position that it's in now, it's nowhere near as good as it was before. So I think rightfully so, it belongs down in D tier. That's it then. Just before we finish, the one thing that I do want to say is that to anyone who says tier lists don't matter and everything's going to change, so you should never really trust a tier list. Tier lists do matter because in a pug world, every single pug group is trying to take the best specs because that gives them the best chance of timing their key, right? So it always matters. The meta matters, doesn't matter what you say. The second question then, right, was you can't be sure. Tier lists don't mean anything because stuff is always going to change. I mean, we're pretty close to Dragonflight now. I don't think too much is going to change. There might still be some nerfs coming for some of these classes that are doing better, but I can never say that this is exactly going to be the answer anyway, right? Anyone who tries to say that doesn't know what they're talking about. There's no way that I can say for sure that these tier lists are going to be exactly right. I think we'll get most of the way there and a good direction of travel, right? So the specs that are getting better and going to be towards the top are going to be in that group. So like, I think that these like 6 or 7 specs are going to be at the top, right? That's, I think, a good way of trying to present the information. The exact order of these is going to be completely up in the air and is going to change wildly depending on what types of dungeons are being run, whether tankiness is really needed, what sort of utility is needed to do the routes, right? All this stuff I can't really try and get an angle on. But the general direction of the specs and whether they're getting better or worse, how they are feeling currently in the Mythic Plus dungeons that we're doing, all of that has gone into this. Simming numbers are going to be going into this. So I think we'll be getting pretty close, right? But it's definitely not going to be 100% true, but I don't think that really matters. I think this is the most information that we can get, and that should be good enough for you guys to try and make your decisions on who you want to main going into Dragonflight. Yeah? Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you have and you want to ask me any questions, feel free to just drop a comment down below. I will try and answer every single comment that comes through my videos, right? You could also hop onto my Discord. I've got a link in the Discord down below. Exactly the same again. Any questions that you've got, feel free to jump on, yeah? I will always try and answer your questions no matter what. I want to try and give back to the community in that regard, so just feel free to come and ask me whatever you want. Hopefully you have enjoyed it though. If you have enjoyed it, we'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.